All right, everyone. Well, let's talk about this whole going back to the office thing and making the decision to go back to the office. So this, in the series that we have, this would normally be where we're talking about change leadership. But as we talked about a few weeks ago when we kind of made the announcement, we're switching to this because so many people have talked to us about making the decision to go back to the office. So in the series that we do, we try and do an analytics focused change webinar in the first half of the month and then a leadership driven one. So we're twisting it a little bit here to focus a little more on decision making. And then next month, we'll talk about presentation, put it in this context as well. So how do we get the data together and then make a data visualization driven case around going back to the office? And then finally, how do you communicate? How are you actually going to communicate this with empathy? Because a lot of groups are going to go back, and as you may know, there's a decent amount of concern about that. So we'll talk a little bit about that in August as well. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, today we're going to talk about a decision. Like, what is a decision? And try and give you a frame around that. And then we'll, from there, step into, well, why even go back to the office? And give you some ideas, hopefully some thought starters on what would be useful and how to bring that into the conversations that you may be having about going back to the office and how to make that decision. And then finally, we'll finish up with a description of how to make a values-based decision. And so we'll put that together in a really short framework for you to help you kind of drive the whole process. So hopefully this helps you be able to actually go do this, actually go make the decision and walk it through with a group on if you're going to go back and then how you're going to go back and what will the office actually be for you when you get there. So the big idea to start off with is if you don't actually make a decision that, well, you really have, right? So not deciding is not putting off the choice, not deciding is making a choice, right? You're choosing the status quo. And so Roxanne and I have seen groups that feel frozen with this decision and don't know how to go about making it, and started to talk to them about, well, you are making a decision. Your decision is to stay remote. So maybe you want to try and make that decision in a more complete and well thought through way. And so that's where we would advocate putting together a process like this. All right, so let's start off with what is a decision. So we think of a decision as this process of eliminating alternatives, right? There's a whole bunch of different possibilities. You're trying to eliminate those in order to be able to make your decision. And that's going to be based on values. What does the group who's making the decision care about? And this really goes back to actually the origin of the word decision. So this is Google's Ngram viewer, and it counts up the number of times a word is used in publication. And you can see that there's been an uptick in words like decide and choice and decision. But the word literally means to cut from. So to cut something away, cut an alternative, in this case, away. So we're going to eliminate things, and then what's left over is going to be the thing that's our choice, and that's going to be based on values. So I'm going to give you this 5-step process. So really kind of condensed. There's lots and lots that we could do and considerable amount of analytics, but I want to pull all that away and just come with a qualitative way to think about how to go about making the decision. And we're going to step through each of these 5 things in order to get there. So the first is to actually set the decision up as a question, like literally put it into the form of a question. And there's a few reasons for that. One is, as in any analytical exercise, having something framed as a question or a hypothesis allows you to know when you're done. So a way to avoid this analysis paralysis thing is to have a specific question, so that when you've answered the question, now you're complete. Now you may ask another question after that, but that's a different process. So similarly, having a decision set up so that it is literally in the form of a question can be focusing on what it is that you're trying to do. And you want that to be related to outcomes. So not a question that's essentially driving to a particular alternative. Because if you're going to do that, then don't go through the process in the first place, because you're really already pointing at your answer. So why do it? And as an interesting technique, and I won't call this 100% foolproof, but it's useful, is to test your question, form it in the opposite. And if it's not asking you something that might be useful, then maybe your original question isn't so great. Like, how do I maximize my profitability? Well, you would never minimize your profitability. So maximizing your profitability might not be such a smart question. So you want to try and tie it in a little tighter so that you're actually pointing at something specific and not just talking about a generality of goodness. So for this idea around the office, we're going to use this just for the purposes of this webinar. So I'm not suggesting this ought to be your question. I'm suggesting you should get one, but I'm going to use this as an example. So how do we start to use the office so that we increase productivity without negatively impacting the culture? So that's going to be the question that we'll put together here. So the next step would be to get together with all of the stakeholders. So who are they? And actually identify who those stakeholders are. And we want to try and be broad with this, right? Because we want to get divergent but still relevant points of view. And so the broader we go, the more of that we're going to get. The way that we want to limit that is not to make it so unwieldy that we can't actually make the decision. So we're going to get a group of people, group of leaders that represent different parts of the organization together. And we want to start to think about this question. What is the one thing that each stakeholder cares about the most? And one of the ways to know that you've gotten a broad enough group is that there's something different in what each stakeholder is going to care about the most. When you start adding in stakeholders and they care about the same thing, you probably got too many people. So you can use that as a rule of thumb to limit the number of folks that you're going to bring into all of this. So in our example here, I'm going to move this along a little bit and actually give some of these to you. So maybe not surprisingly, the sales manager wants to increase sales. What else would a sales manager want? And so maybe the sales manager is thinking about that. If we were back in the office, can I get faster response to customer requests? Because we're going to be together and I can speed that up. The manufacturing manager, however, might not care. We, and the manufacturing means all the manufacturing people, have always been in the office. It's you, other people that have been able to be remote. In order to make things, you got to be in the factory to go make them. And so that person's got a completely different point of view. Whoever the legal manager is might really care about the risks that are going on in the office. And you can see all the rest. So you might have quite a divergent sets of points of view depending on the group they represent and their history and who they are. But what we want to try and pull together is understand this from the point of view of what do they care about? So what do they value? And then we want to, from there, move to how will that value be measured? And we want to get to that measurement because that's going to help us get to objectives. And that's really what we're trying to get to. What are the objectives for the organization that we are trying to meet based on whatever the alternative is that we picked? And we're going to evaluate all these alternatives based on the objectives. So we want to start off with essentially, what do you care about? And then we want to put some metrics around that. So now we can express that as more of an objective. So if the sales manager wants a faster response time to customers, what is the response time right now? Can we even measure that? And then can we know whether or not it's getting better as a result of the decision? And that's the process that we would go through with all of these. And one of the things that you want to think about as you go through this, and I'll ask you guys to just kind of think about it in your own mind as we look at these, is how would you evaluate the effectiveness of these statements? So are they specific enough? Are you able to put a measure on them? The manufacturing manager saying, I don't care, that's not really very measurable. So that might not be a value that's actually going to be super helpful here. Although I bet you've experienced being in a group meeting where stuff like that comes up. And so it's not necessarily contributing to the decision. And so by going through a process like this and asking people these more specific questions, so what do you really care about? Not what are you mad about, but what do you care about? And then how will we go about measuring that to put it together is a way to start to pull out all of these different possibilities and then actually be able to determine the values. And then what we want to do is we want to come up with a way to structure them. And the way we're going to think about doing that is via a means to ends diagram. So it is unlikely that every single thing that is valued by all of those people are all primary objectives and that they don't interact with each other. That's almost never going to happen. So what we're going to find is that some of the things people value as we turn them into objectives are actually subsets of others. So one leads to the other, or one is a means to the other, which is an end. And so in this diagram I have here, I'm having this show as a flow from left to right. And so the final ultimate objectives that we want are the three that you see in the darker tan color. So we're going to keep increased productivity, strengthen the culture, and mitigate the transition risk. And we would have to have measures around all of those, but I didn't want to put all that in the slide, so I'm trying to keep it simple for you. The stuff that's in the orange leads into the stuff that's in that darker tan, and the ideas that are in the green, for the most part, lead into the orange. And so we can have a hierarchical structure, and I wouldn't go beyond 3. If you get past 3, it gets really overly cumbersome to try and manage. So this is fine. You can, if you're only at 2 levels, that's fine as well. And then use that as a way to understand how are we going to measure those 3 that are out to the right. And I would really try and shoot for something in the 3 to 5 range as your ultimate objectives. Again, you start getting more and more of that, then it becomes difficult to manage. And then each objective becomes smaller and smaller portion of the decision problem, and it doesn't really have that much impact and starts to wash out. So what do you really care about? And make sure that as a group, that's what's getting articulated and put down. And then that's what we're going to go try and drive this whole process against. So now we know what the objectives are, those things that are in the tan. Now we got to go figure out what are all our alternatives. So it could very well be only 2, like we're either all going in the office or we're all staying home. But you might come up with something more nuanced than that. And there could be other elements in it, like how do you decide to go back? How do you communicate it as you're going through this process? How do you involve other people to make it all happen? So there could be a lot more to it than just these 2 alternatives with 1-sentence descriptions. Everybody stays home, everybody goes back to the office. And a way to get at that is to think about those second to last objectives, those things that were the means to the final objective, and lay them across the top. And so that's what I've done here. There was 1 green one and then the 4 orange ones that all led into those tan areas. And what we're going to do is we're going to think through the extremes of ways in which we might be able to satisfy those objectives. So we're essentially coming up with parts of an alternative. And we might start with something that is very conventional, like if I want a transparent process, well, we'll kick out regular emails. And, that's fine, but nothing particularly interesting about that. But to push our thinking, we might go all the way to an extreme. So in this case, an extreme is we're going to have everyone in the company contribute to the decision. Like, you want to get transparent? Well, everyone's in. So if you have 50 people, that might be hard, but doable. If you have 50,000 people, that's likely impossible. So it's going to depend. It'll be context dependent on where you are. And you can see all the other ones. And I'm just giving some examples here across these areas. And what we're going to do is basically create a walk through these alternative components to create a full alternative. So I'll just color this a little bit to make things stand up. So a walk might look something like this. So I'm going to start off, and I like the idea of town halls to have our discussion. And then I may, want to bounce over and go, I'm going to post the plan on the company website and make sure I'm including all the company suggestions in it. And then I might create a go back to the office bonus, because that's going to be part of my plan to keep my retention up. And then I might want to include press releases, because we like it when people hear about the good things that we're doing as an organization. And I might push a little bit on this idea about keeping our why clear by engaging the company in the discussion about our why and how the office contributes to our why. So I'm taking all of those pieces, and then my first alternative then is I'm going to use a town hall focused communication to guide the process with a significant amount of external transparency. And that's the alternative that I might put out. I'll do this a few more times, and you want to do it with the group of decision makers. so that you can come up with the different possibilities for how it is that you're going to execute on this. And now once you've got those different possibilities, you can look at your objectives that you have and score how effective each alternative is at fulfilling on any one of your objectives. And you add all those up, and then you get a view as to how useful is the alternative. And again, as you can see probably in my language, you can become very analytical with this. So I can build quite complex models with this. I'm in the middle right now teaching the class in decision analytics at the University of Richmond, and that's exactly what those MBA students are going to do. They're building out a complex model, but you don't need to do that to make a lot of progress. You can do something as light as this to be able to expand your thinking about what the possibilities are, and to get the group of decision makers together in a way that allows them to be more engaged in the decision. More of what people care about is included in the decision process, and that process itself is cleaner. It's more of a better hygiene process. So the big idea at the very end here is that to really be a decision, it has to be an irrevocable allocation of resources. And each of those words matters in there. So on the irrevocable side, I'm sure you guys have experienced this, where you've had a meeting, you've been together, you thought you had a decision, 2 or 3 weeks later, you're in a meeting again, and you're talking about the same thing. And you're thinking, didn't we already decide this? And the answer is no, you didn't decide it, because you didn't actually allocate the resources. And as a result of that, they're now off doing whatever they're supposed to do. And what I mean by that is, did you spend the money? Have you said, okay, we're going to take so-and-so and so-and-so, they're now working on this thing that kicked off an effort to go do it? That you've really taken whatever resources you have and you've used them, you're allocating them to go do something. If you haven't done that yet, then you haven't really made a decision. You've talked about something, you may have had a great discussion, and you've done much of this process, but you haven't really made the decision. So how do you make it? You have to communicate. So to really make a decision, you're going to have to communicate it so that those people and that money and the time and any other resources are in there actually go do the thing that you said you wanted to go do. So let's say we pick that first alternative. So we're going to have this town hall, focused communication to guide the process, and with a significant amount of external transparency. Now we got to think about how we're going to communicate that, right? It could be as simplistic as throwing it up on the intranet site, probably not the appropriate way to go for something like this. And then you can see we're just kind of laddering up to things that are more and more involved. Are you sending an email or using an electronic system like Slack? Are you doing audio meetings like you might be doing on the phone? Or are you actually getting people together to do Zoom meetings or do something even in person just to show people what's going on in the office before you actually pull the trigger on a decision to get people into the office? So you're really trying to communicate, why are you doing this? What are you doing? And how are you going to go do it? And then once you've done that, now you're in the land of actually really being able to make a decision. And so that's the very last step in the process. And so often it's just not done. And if you haven't done that last step, then you haven't completed the decision process. You've done a bunch of good discussion maybe and some analysis and maybe you framed the problem well, but you haven't completed the decision. So this is really about decision hygiene. It's not about making the right answer. It's about having a process that brings everybody together so that it is clean in how you're going about making a decision. This by itself isn't going to create some sort of absolute perfect decision. There isn't such a thing, but it can set up a process that can be better. So 1, you want to have a decision question. And then 2, get the stakeholders, all the stakeholders involved that are going to be important in this. Understand what all of those stakeholders value, sort of the values that they have. And then create alternatives by doing a walkthrough and taking pieces and combining them together into a complete alternative. And then lastly, make and communicate the decision so that everybody knows what's going on with what the group has finally decided. And if you do that, I think you're going to have a much better, clearer process that will bring in more points of view, and you will get a better decision as a result of that. At a minimum, you'll get one that is much more easy to communicate and is much more transparent in the process, which will make people much more comfortable. All right, so let's go on to the second point here, which is why go back to the office in the first place? And the way in which I would think about the office is as a tool. So the office is a tool, and like any other tool, it's got a specific use. So just to use an example here, let's imagine that we have a software development company and they're thinking about going back to the office. And they're starting to think about it because people are telling them, or the management think that there's a whole bunch of different things that might be valuable in there. So collaboration, and we'll communicate better, and we can be more creative, and we build the team, and people are able to innovate better. And there's probably something in there right in the center about culture, right? Our culture needs to be there. And I'm not saying any of those are wrong, but I think the immediate thing that is probably going to pop up in people's mind is, well, what's been going on the last year and a half, right? So we've been doing this from our homes for a year and a half, and a lot of these things are happening. Like, we have been collaborating, we do communicate. I feel like I've done some pretty creative work. So on and on they'll go and refute those as possibilities for what's really happening here. So maybe a different way to think about it that we would suggest is something that leaders ought to consider here is, what's really the point of a business? And I know that sounds kind of philosophical, but when I think about that, the point of a company coming together is to get a group of people to go do something that a single person can't do. So why do we have these companies? Because you can't do it on your own. And so you got to bring more people together to go do it. So that's why they exist. We've been doing that remotely for a year and a half. And there is a lot of success in that. It's not like every single company collapsed. That's not what happened. They're still running, and things are going on that are working well. So instead, it suggests that people think about the office as a tool. And so does that office help you do something that you can't do while you're working remotely? And focusing in on that as a way to start to think about the alternatives that might be available in terms of, quote, going back to the office. And to be sure, there are some groups that are trying to do that, and they're setting up things like, okay, well, we're going to be partly in and partly out. But some of those I would say are a bit shallow, right? It's almost like a compromise. I don't know that they've really gone through a decision process on that. Maybe some of them have. It's not like I've been in all those meetings, but are they doing it because we actually figured out how to use the office well? Or are we doing it because it's a compromise and so many of our employees actually want to stay at home? We management think they're going to do something different and better in the office. And so we're going to come up with some sort of a blended 2 days in one place, 3 days in the other. Instead, thinking about what can you actually do that you can't do remotely, and being able to focus in on that as a way to kind of pull all of this together is a process to make that more effective. And I think is going to be more convincing and compelling for the employees of the company, because they'll see why that is and what we're going to be able to do. I think there's also a reasonable concern out there that we're living off of the connections that we've made 2+ years ago. And that as new employees are coming in and they're having to work remotely, that some of those connections aren't there. So there seems to be something around what can you do when you're face-to-face and interact? What is the value of that interaction? And then how do you use that to go make something good happen? There's certainly a bunch of value that can be made sitting at your dining room table and working off of your computer. Lots of people are doing that. So clearly we've proved that that's possible. How do we think about what's going to be useful when we go back to the business? The last thing that we would add into that is, are you doing it in a way to build your culture? And for us, that means cultivating joy at work. And so the idea that we have around that is there are these dimensions, and you can take those dimensions in. And we have this guide that we put together that describes all of that and describes that work. And that is a a way, I think, to think about how to actually build on your culture and put those in as part of the things that you value, which means they become objectives as part of the decision to go back to the office. And so one of those elements, what we would say is, you should be going back to the office in part to achieve the objective of growing joy at work. All right, so let's touch on this last piece, and then I'll be interested to hear what you guys think or what questions that you have. So I want to just give you a quick outline of a values-based decision-making approach that you can use to kind of encapsulate all of this together. So this is going to go down into a little bit more detail. I kind of gave you the high-level part at the beginning. So how we're going to take all this so that we can execute this group decision with a high level of decision hygiene. So in this, we're going to need to get into some level of metrics, right? So what I talked about before was higher level. We're talking about what you value, but in order to get to objectives, you got to be able to measure it. And so we want to make those based on what you value, as we talked about. So each decision maker would describe that, and you could think of that as, what does success mean to them? And then we can craft the metrics to be able to monitor for that success. We want to go through that exercise. And I'm showing you this metrics identifier exercise here on the left because it's a tool that Roxanne and I have put together that helps through all this. But I'm giving you the high level overview of that now. The second part is really based on the idea of scenario planning. So we want to test the impact based on a set of scenarios. And one of the important ways to think about that is that we want to think not in terms of a single number that could be there, but what are the possibilities? What's the distribution of numbers that could happen? And so an easy way to think about that without getting all mathy is to start off with, what's the most likely value? What do I think can happen? And that, that may be the average, but there could be others in there. But if you don't know, an average is a good place to start. And then what is the spread of those values? So what's the highest value? What's the lowest reasonable value? And what do I think the variation is in there? You can take variance, again, another math term, but just generally, how much is it going to vary in there? Those are effectively the same thing. And then an understanding of what the shape of that distribution is. Is it even or uniform all the way through? If you don't know what it is, then that's a good way to handle it. Just take it as a uniform distribution of possibilities from the highest to the lowest. Well, there are a lot of things, as I'm sure you guys know, that are that bell-shaped curve, a normal distribution. So things that tend to group in close in around the mean, and most of the values are around the mean, although there are values that spread out towards the highest and lowest. But there could be others, so things that are pushed all the way to one side, like an exponential distribution. But beyond that, I just wouldn't push it to get that much more complicated. You'll get a great result just thinking about it across those three. That's plenty to use here. And so what's that spread of possibilities up and down those distributions? And then, and this is really the key part, you want to come up with contingency plans based on risk. And a way to think about that is through a pre-mortem exercise. So if a post-mortem is you wait for the thing to break and then you look back and go, what happened? How did this break? A pre-mortem would be to think about it ahead of time and imagine that whatever has gone wrong out in the future, and then guess why. What are all the possibilities for why that could have happened? What's going on in the system that made that? And then if you can, create mechanisms to actually prevent that failure. That would be the best. You don't have to worry about it at all. But there's likely going to be some in there that you won't be able to do that. So for those, have metrics in place that tell you, are you heading to the bad place or not? And then create your contingency plans now when you can be calm and dispassionate about it, and everyone's not in the conference room with their hair on fire trying to figure out what's going on. You do it now so that when the bad thing does happen, you have that contingency plan and you're able to take it on. So as we think about a process of going back to the office, you may have really figured it out and you really think you have it nailed, but something happens along the way and it creates a significant problem. All of a sudden, lots of people are starting to leave the company, or at least talking about leaving the company because they don't want to go back to the office. What are you going to do about that? So understanding what that is now is going to make handling that in the heat of the moment so much better. All right, all of this that we've been talking about is wrapped into our new change analytics concentration. And I do mean new. So Roxanne and I have just finished this thing, and we've got it out there. It's a new iteration of it. And we've set it up into these 4 areas of first choosing the data, then how do you collect all that data, how do you analyze it, and how do you present the data? And what we've just talked about is wrapped around all of that stuff. And we've set it up now as immediate access. So once you sign in, you get all this stuff, and it's all the tools. There's recordings that describe all the tools. But then what we do on top of that is that we have these live sessions, and we have them scheduled every other week, thank you, every other month, not every other week. That would be way too many. Every other month, and we take a few hours to go through a simulation and actually use all of these. And this metric stuff shows up in our other 2 courses that you see there as well. One for people that are leading change, and then the top one there is for change professionals, people that are trying to get their certification in change. And that's it. That's all our big stuff. So I'll leave this up here so you guys know how you can get in touch with us. And let's talk about some questions.
So Don has some questions.
Don,
hey Ed, this is Don Taylor. Good afternoon now. Who would have thought 2 years ago or back on March 12th of 2020 that we even had to make a decision about this? How crazy is that?
Yeah, it just shows how the world changes.
Exactly. Second comment is I like your point about a compromise, because it does feel like from what I read, a lot of companies are making a compromise decision, which is a pretty good thing, because I think they're satisfying both ends of the questions. My question for you had to do with how you factor in time, and it's really a 2-part question. So here's both parts. First part is, how do you factor in the amount of time that you're giving yourself to make the decision? The conventional side might not require as much time. The loony side might require a lot of time. So how do you factor in time that you give yourself? And number 2, how do you factor in the amount of time that you're giving yourself to implement whatever your decision you come up with?
Yeah, that's great. Both are great, Don. I think the second one's maybe easier, so I'll do that one first. I think of that, like the implementation part of that, as an objective that I would pull into the decision-making process. So it may be, there could be more value to going faster. There might be a lot of value in going faster, or there might not be that much value at all in going faster. And so taking a look at that and understanding where the usefulness is. So there may be an alternative that takes days to implement, another alternative that takes weeks to implement, depending on your objective around time and where that value actually is. Then those 2 alternatives will score differently against that objective. And so that's one way to think about the actual implementation of it.
All right.
I probably have a more squishy answer for you on the first one. So I'm not sure you can necessarily analyze your way into how much time should I take analyzing my way into it, because it's sort of a circular argument. The more I analyze, the more I understand how much time I actually should be analyzing, and all of a sudden it's a month later and you missed it, right? So you kind of go round and round with that. So I do think that that's probably some more around leadership judgment. That take that as Ed's opinion about that. I don't know done any research. I don't know of a paper that showed that. I don't know if anybody's tried an experiment. I don't know any of that. But that's how I would think about it. But that comes much more from having been a manager for a long time, not from being an analyst and a quant.
All right. I think for this particular topic under discussion, some of it also is influenced by external decisions. Decisions made by governments or whoever.
Yeah, that's a great example, right? You do not get to make this decision all by yourself, right? Or you do not make this decision without influences from other places. That's probably a better way to say it. And you get,
perhaps,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that feels like another input into your decision-making framework that you have to be cognizant of at least.
Yeah, so if you were in my class last night, Don, what we would be talking about, what we would have been talking about is events and the probability that an event can happen and how that impacts this whole decision process, right? So the event could be the Commonwealth of Virginia says, we're going back to masks. What's the probability of that happening? And then how does that impact any of my alternatives? So maybe I'm way less excited about going back to the office if we all have to wear masks again. Maybe I'm not, it would depend on your circumstance and the context in which you're trying to make the decision.
Yeah. And then my very last comment was about a pre-mortem. I think that's a great idea to think in advance what other outcomes might happen and what are we going to do if that comes true. So I think that's a really good idea for people to be considering.
Yeah.
Thanks. And
Yeah, so what's interesting about this conversation for me is when I think about, so Ed thinks about things from a decision perspective, I think of things about it from a change perspective kind of first. And so when you think about a change event where something is coming up, you plan for it. But what we're talking about here is more emergent change, because to your point, Don, there are going to be decisions that come up with this particular situation that we can't predict, right? We can make some probability guess and all of that, which is important. But what I would say is, because we're in an emergent change kind of situation, it's almost like you have decision change. It's kind of what's happening. It's kind of circular. So to your point earlier about, okay, this is what our goal is, overarching, we want these goals, and here's how we're going to measure it. You constantly have to take in new information and potentially make new decisions and then implement them right away. And in terms of your time question, I always think of it as what's the immediate need in terms of implementation, because there's usually, from a people perspective, an immediate need, and that has a lot to do with communication, what decisions people are waiting for. And even acknowledging, hey, we haven't made this decision and here's why we haven't made it, can go a long way to implement, right? Really is what we're talking about. So it's kind of a circular thing in this situation. When we talk about event change, you sort of have decision. Okay, we made the decision, we're doing this. Okay, change, let's figure out how to implement. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking more of a circular thing. So it's a learning process. I think you have to be open to the learning, and that pre-mortem is even more important in an emergent change situation. So I would just add that to the conversation.
What other thoughts you guys have, or questions, comments? Is everybody rushing back to the office? You've all made a decision.
We're going in.
Hey, it's a bit. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I just didn't mean to speak over you. Hey, this is Bill Klimek. Nice presentation. Hey, you mentioned decision hygiene. Can you just say a little bit about the definition of that? Is that the process you showed, or do you define it a little differently? I just kind of curious how you're using that term.
I think about it, Bill, as having a process that people know and are following as a group, as opposed to what I'm sure you've experienced, at least some. I certainly have. Probably everybody on this Zoom call has experienced one where all the points don't come out, what people care about doesn't come out. Maybe somebody rises as a louder voice than is necessary and drives the decision, and as a result of that, you end up pushed more towards what that single person cares about as opposed to what the group cares about. So when I think of decision hygiene, I think of a setup that's got a process to it that everybody can follow. They see what's going on. They may in the end still dislike the decision, right? It doesn't meet their values the way that they would want to, but they can at least see that that alternative does meet those of the rest of the group. And so they may be disappointed that they're not getting the thing that they would most like, but they at least have visibility now into seeing how that particular answer is going to work for everybody else.
Yeah, and how we would think about that in terms of psychological safety is everyone feels respected in the process.
Thanks. Yeah, nice presentation. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Amanda, did you have something? I think it was you, but I'm not sure.
Oh, hey, I love you guys. Just something that's come up that was a little unexpected that kind of jumps into the tail end of what we're talking about is walk with the team through their decision making. We've got the decision, we're ready to roll it out. But some of the early feelers are coming back with something unexpected in that people are feeling like their HIPAA rights are being violated. Because the team said, hey, on our system, wear a mask if you're not vaccinated, and now it's a disclosure. So I didn't want to really launch into that, but I just wondered if either people on the group or you guys have just heard that, hey, it's nice you have a decision, but we have now this whole other health component on privacy that's kind of overlaying.
Yeah, well, it's definitely coming up
Yeah.
with our clients, and we've seen it in articles, you know, and so where are you? Now you're in like a legal space. And that is, you know, that's a whole area of specialization that you have to get advice on, because there are implications there that you can't know unless you get that kind of advice. So yeah, I mean, it's a big thing for sure. This was kind of coming up a year ago when we were doing some interviews with people, and there was concern about exactly what you're talking about. So I elect to stay home because I'm concerned about my own health, because I'm immune compromised or whatever. Does that mean that I won't be included in projects because they're at the office and I'm not in the office? And for whatever reason, people attach my lack of presence physically to my maybe lack of interest or lack of being in it as much as them. All kinds of things have come out in that area. So I think it's kind of a different take on what you're talking about. It can kind of go into diversity, inclusion, and equity space, that particular topic.
Yeah, I think it just feeds into exactly what you're saying, which is that, you know, as soon as we actually do go back to work, we're going to be right back here and getting back into the circle of, okay, what changes do we have to consider and what modifications do we make? And
Yeah, and I think thinking through the contingencies ahead of time would be useful, right? Because you're going to just imagine that you make this very difficult, what seems to be for many, very difficult decision about how you're going to use the office. And then to your point, another event comes up or another concern arises, and now the situation's different. So you got another decision to make. Are we going to stay with where we are? Are we going to alter what is going on right now and do this in a different way? And what I showed in the few minutes here is grossly oversimplified for how complicated this thing is. So I certainly recognize that, but I think it's going to be a much more complicated process to pull this together.
awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
sure.
Hey, Jonathan, see you got your hand up. Got something?
Hey, Ed. Hey, Roxanne. First, I apologize for the noise. It's I'm being dad today, so I love this time. One of the things that's interesting that came up, we had to make a decision very early on. We were trying to hire some people, and the question at the beginning of the pandemic, and the question was, do we restrict? We were a very local culture. Do we restrict everything with what we're doing to only doing local hires, or knowing that this is going to be a year plus experience, do we open it up? So we made the decision to open up our hiring. So now we've got people all over the East Coast. And so the challenge now that we're trying to really focus on is not so much when we come back to the office, but how do we create a space, a hybridized space, where we don't have siloed communications and culture that's happening in the office, that people aren't just walking by your desk and saying, oh, hey, let's chat about that for a few minutes. And we just had an instance of something like that happening where there was a meeting that was going on, and most of the people were in the office, but it excluded some people. So trying to really put forth the effort to say, look, we need to really focus on inclusion right now, and how do we set that up? So I mean, there's not necessarily really a question there, but it's something that I'm struggling with I guess really shifting and changing that culture from what we were before to what we are now. And I suspect that a lot of organizations are struggling with those same sort of inevitable changes. Things just aren't the same as they were before.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. They aren't the same, but they don't have to be, we don't have to be feeling like it's helpless, right? So we would encourage people to at least have a mindset of reimagining things of, okay, well, if this is the way it is, how would it be ideally for everyone? Just as a thought exercise, so we can kind of get out of the negative mindset that potentially is there, that we're seeing a lot, right? Because it feels in a way impossible to tackle. But if you can remember what you already know about this, which is a lot. We have worked in hybrid situations before. We haven't necessarily called them hybrid, but we don't necessarily haven't historically, any one of us work with people in the same room the entire time. So there are good things that you can remember about what worked in that situation and what didn't work in that situation. A great example of that is, I remember when I was, I guess, considered remote from everyone else, and I would dial into the meeting and it felt like I was dialing into a cocktail party, right? And so that was not helpful. And so, I talked to the team about that, and we worked on how to make sure conversations are more inclusive, to your point. But there's this other concept that's out there, which is about building community amongst employees, the virtual community. And there is an article that we can send to you about this. There are a lot of examples that companies have done, specific things that companies have done over the last year and a half to be really intentional about keeping their culture together and felt by everyone by creating a sense of community. It can sound, sort of nice to have and soft, but what we're talking about now with the great resignation is, it's actually hitting people's bottom line to be paying more attention to culture than they have necessarily in the past. So you want to retain the folks you have, and you want to attract the talent that you're looking for. So building that sense of community and that connection between me and my work, me and my coworkers, me and my team, me and my company, that matters much more. And so building a community seems to be another focus that people have been talking about for the last year and a half. I don't know if you would comment.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a major, what you're describing, Jonathan, is going to be a major issue in the future. It's just become, there's all kinds of, how do you become effective? How are you inclusive? How are you fair? Are people, what kind of an organization are people going to want to go to? All of that, I think, deserves a lot more attention than maybe people are talking about so far. I think that's going to be quite difficult. And you are, I don't know how many we've heard the story that you told, but I've heard that story a lot. So there are a lot of companies that have been hiring for the last year and a half, and they stopped. They were primarily very local. They stopped doing that, and so now they've got a distributed group of employees, and so you can't go back to the office in the same way that you did 2 years ago. You have to do something different, or you're going to end up with trouble if that's not really well thought through.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the thoughts on that. Yeah, if you've got that article, that would be amazing. And I know we had at least one person that cited, kind of the lack of community during a fully remote environment, that as one of their reasons that they needed to leave, and just not having that sense of camaraderie that was very important to them. And it just really reinforced, Roxanne, to your point, community sounds soft. It sounds like, oh, this is just a nice to have, but it's not. It's a really critical thing. So I appreciate the thoughts on it. And also, Ed, I appreciate you sharing that so many people have expressed that same challenge. It makes me feel like I'm not alone.
No, definitely not. No, it's pretty common right now.
All right, folks, well, we've taken you over time, so we're well past 12:30. So we'll stop and say thank you. Roxanne and I'll hang on. So if anybody wants to stay, that's great. But we know that you guys probably have dozens of other things to go do. So we'll say thank you
Yes.
for
thank you.
spending some time with us. We appreciate it. And we'll let you know about the next one. We'll be doing these every week or every month. I'll get that right eventually. All right, folks, see ya.
Hey, thanks so much.
All right, bye.
Hey, Leanne, are you on? Oh, she's not.